Good morning, everyone. This is Miss Xiao here. I'm the teacher at Learning at Miss Xiao's, and today I'll be covering a topic that is familiar yet unfamiliar with students, which is number patterns. Now, number patterns has been a topic that has been covered since primary 1, and sometimes even in preschools, whereby the students are given a sequence of numbers and they're asked to find the next one that's not given. However, as students, progress on to upper primary, they find that they struggle with number patterns as they get more complicated. Let's take a look at some examples of number patterns and see how we can come about to get the answer. Now, this paper, this question over here is taken from Catholic High, P4SA2 paper 2019. Now, let's take a look at this question and see how we might attempt to solve it. It says that the patterns below are made up of identical shaded and identical unshaded squares. Find the total number of squares in pattern 4. Now, noting that they ask you to find the total number of squares in pattern 4, there is obviously a pattern going on. So let's look in terms of the columns, the different columns, and try and spot the pattern. So if you were to look at the first column over here, okay, this tells you about the pattern number, and it goes in chronological order. That means 1, 2, 3, and the next one will be 4. It's very systematic. And from one number to another, you add 1. Okay, now let's move on to the next column, whereby you have the number of shaded squares. What pattern do you see over here? You might be thinking, how come the number is 4 shaded, in terms of shaded squares, regardless of the pattern number? All right, this is actually the pattern of the second column. So number of shaded squares will always be 4. Let me just put a note down. This number is always 4. Okay, now let's move on to the third column. So the third column tells you about the number of unshaded squares. Okay, so I will note it down in blue. Now, what can we take note of in terms of the number of unshaded squares? So we notice that this pattern is an increasing pattern. That means as the number pattern increases, the pattern number increases, the number of unshaded square will increase. And let's see whether it will increase in a consistent number. So from 5 to 12, it's an addition of 7. From 12 to 21, it's an addition of 9. Okay, so it looks like it increases in consecutive odd numbers. So let me just put this down. It increases in consecutive odd numbers. And finally, let's take a look at the last column. So the last column, we can see that the total number of squares, it is also increasing as the pattern number increases. And do you notice anything interesting about the total number of squares? Other than it being increasing, actually under pattern number 1, 9 is made up of 3 times 3. Pattern number 2, 16 is made up of 4 times 4. And pattern number 3, 25 is made up of 5 times 5. Oh, so what does this tell you? It is actually the product of two numbers that are the same. And what else can we say about the numbers? You see, it's the number 3 multiplied by 3 is found in pattern number 1. So pattern number 1 gives you a product of 3 by 3 in terms of total number of squares. And how do we derive 3 from pattern 1? We add 2 to the pattern number. And let's see whether this applies for pattern number 2 as well. So if we look at pattern number 2, we should expect the product of the numbers in total number of squares to be 2 more than 2. So let's check. Yes, we do have 4 times 4, and 4 is 2 plus 2. And let's double check with regards to pattern number 3. Pattern number 3 will correspond to the product of 5 times 5 because 5 is 3 plus 2. And yeah, we got it. Okay, so from here, we can actually see that the last column, in terms of total number of squares, okay, it is broken down into one number multiplied by itself, and this number is actually 2 more than the pattern number. Okay, so if I were to summarize the last column, I would write it something like pattern number multiplied by pattern number plus 2 multiplied by pattern number plus 2. Okay, now let's take a look now at the questions. Once, since now we have already kind of broken down the pattern in the table. So find the total number of squares in pattern 4. Question wants us to find total number of squares, which means we need to refer to the last column. So if it is pattern 4, total number of squares will have to be pattern number plus 2 times pattern number plus 2. So total number of squares will be 4 plus 2 multiplied by 4 plus 2, which is 6 times 6. So answer will be 36 squares. Now, let's move on to finding the number of unshaded squares in pattern 4. Take note that the total number of squares is actually made up of the shaded squares and unshaded squares. We want to find the number of unshaded squares. Now, there are 2 ways to go around it. One way is to look at the column and derive the number of unshaded squares. And another way is to actually seek out the total number of squares and the number of shaded squares. From the previous question in A, we know that the total number of squares in pattern 4 is 36. So we could put down 36, where total number of squares is. Now, could we find the shaded squares for this pattern? Yes, if we look at column 2, we realize that the number of shaded squares remains constant at 4 regardless of the pattern number. So we will replace shaded squares with 4. Okay. And what we are left with in this number statement is unshaded squares. Okay, so total number of squares is 4 plus unshaded squares. So number of unshaded squares will be 36 subtract 4. So that gives you 32. All right. Now, lastly, we move on to C, whereby we look at the pattern number that has a total of 100 squares. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the right-hand side of the page. So if we were to have a total of 100 squares, we need to make a reference to the last column. Okay, and we need to consider what 2 numbers that are the same multiply to give you 100. So it can be broken down into 10 times 10. Yeah, for those students who know what square root is all about, okay, you can display your answer something like that. Square root of 100 is 10. So if this number here is actually the pattern number plus 2. 2 added to the pattern number to make 10. We can find the pattern number. So pattern number, and we add 2 to it, that gives us 10. So the pattern number is 10 minus 2, which gives us 8. So which pattern number? It is actually pattern number 8. All right, so that solves the first question. Now we are going to move on to the second question, which is somewhat slightly different. Again, question 45, taken from Mary Stella High School Primary. This is also a question from the P4 SA2 2019 paper. Now it says that the patterns are formed with identical squares. Study the pattern carefully and answer the questions below. So pattern number 1 has got 6 squares, 2 has got 10 squares, 3 has got 14 squares, so on and so forth. Okay, we need to derive a certain pattern, a general pattern, okay, with whatever that we are given over here, so that we can solve for the number of squares in pattern 18. Wow, okay, let's see. So let's get to work. Let's see whether the pattern in terms of number of squares increases with the pattern number. So you see that from 6 to 10, yes, there is an increase in 4. From 10 to 14, there is also an increase in 4. All right, so you realize that the increase is rather consistent. And we can expect that from pattern 3 to pattern 4, it will be another increase in 4. So what we can summarize this into is that instead of writing down 6, 10, 14, 18, 22, so on and so forth, we want to come up with a general pattern. What do I mean by that? Okay, what I mean by that is I'm going to put down the pattern for the pattern in terms of number of squares for pattern 1 as 6. And then the next one will be 6 plus 4. And for pattern 3, it will be 6 plus 4 plus 4. And of course, it goes on and on and on. Now, from this general pattern, we can derive something from it. We realize that from all the patterns that we've come up with, it is 6 plus a certain multiple of 4, right? Because you realize that there's this 4 that is added to, this number of multiples of 4 that is added to the original 6 that you have in pattern 1. So we could possibly write this as 6 adding on to the 0th multiple of 4. The next one will be 6 adding on to the first multiple of 4. And subsequently, 6 plus 4 times 2. So on and so forth. And from here, you can slowly derive a conclusion that 6 plus 4 times, 6 plus 4 times, 6 plus 4 times seems to be repeating itself. Other than that, if you were to look at the last number that changes all the time, now you have the last number as 0 in pattern number 1, the last number as 1 in pattern number 2, the last number as 2 in pattern number 3. What is this relationship between the last number in the general pattern and the pattern number? You realize that the pattern number is always 1 more than this last digit in the general pattern. So to derive the last digit in the general pattern, we take the pattern number and we subtract 1 from it. Okay, so this is how we derive the pattern, general pattern. So how many squares will there be in pattern 18? If we go down the line, we have, pattern 18, we will still have something like 6 plus 4 times something, right? Okay, so we have 6 plus 4 times, okay, which, you know, this particular frame is consistent regardless of the pattern number. So what is this last number that we are going to put in? Remember, this last number is actually 1 less than the pattern number. So 1 less than the pattern number would be 18 minus 1, which is 17. So how would we work that out to the number of squares? So we take 17 times 4, 28. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 plus 2, 6. So we have 68. 68 added to 6. So that gives us 74. So this is the answer for A. Now for B, which pattern is formed with 134 squares? So now they tell you that, okay, 6 plus 4 times something will give you 134. And how are we going to work backwards to that? Okay, now let's see. This is a multiple of 4 and you add 6 to it to get 134. We need to find that multiple of 4, which means we got to take away 6 from 134 first. So what we are left with will be that multiple of 4. So 134 minus 6 gives you 128. So what is that multiple of 4 that will give you 128? So to find out, we take 128 divided by 4 and we get 32. Now, but wait, this is not the answer. How do we get the answer then? 32 is but the number represented by the question mark. How do we link back the number in the question mark to the pattern number? So if you were to recall, the number in the question mark is always 1 less than the pattern number. So the pattern number will be 32 plus 1, which is 33. So this is the answer for 45B. I hope that going through these two questions will give you a better insight on finding the general pattern of questions such as this. And I believe that with more practice, you should get better and more familiar with the questions. If you have any questions, anything you want to clarify, feel free to email me by searching up at my Facebook page, Learning at Miss Xiao. There is a link there that you can direct message me or you can email me. Alternatively, you could get in contact with me through my blog, http://learnwithmissiao.wordpress.com, or you could search up my YouTube resource channel if you would like to find out more about the other videos that I have as well in terms of learning maths. So I hope you have an enjoyable day. Take care, stay safe, goodbye.